Every stone castle you have ever seen is a lie, not in its walls or its towers. Those are real enough. The lie is in what is missing. We walk through medieval ruins today and see bare rock, empty chambers, cold gray surfaces open to the wind. We assume this is how it was. We imagine nights shivering through frozen winters, medieval life as a perpetual endurance test between wars. But strip the plaster from a Georgian townhouse, remove the carpets from a Victorian parlor, tear out the curtains and the wallpaper and the furniture, and that room would look just as bleak. What we see in a ruined castle is not a medieval room, it is a skeleton. The people who lived within those walls were not fools. They were thermal engineers, working with wool, lime, and rushes instead of fiberglass and foam. And the techniques they developed are using materials that grew wild or cost almost nothing, could keep a stone chamber 30 degrees warmer than the air outside. Some of those techniques still work today. To understand how medieval people manage heat, we need to first understand what we have gotten wrong about their buildings. The popular image of a medieval castle, cold, damp, austere, comes almost entirely from what survives. And what survives is stone. Stone lasts. Everything else, the plaster, the paint, the textiles, the timber partitions, the floor coverings, decayed or was stripped away centuries ago. When Henry VIII dissolved the English monasteries in the 1530s, teams of workmen were dispatched to pull lead from roofs, tear timber from halls, and cart away anything of value. What remained was the carcass. When we visit that carcass today and shiver, we mistake the skeleton for the living body. In their prime, these buildings were anything but bare. Interior walls were coated in thick lime plaster, often painted in vivid colors, deep reds, cobalt blues, forest greens, or decorated with elaborate murals depicting biblical scenes, heraldic devices, and hunting parties. Floors were buried under deep layers of rushes mixed with aromatic herbs. Windows, far from being open holes in the wall, were fitted with wooden shutters, oiled linen stretched over frames, or thin translucent sheets of animal horn that admitted light while blocking wind. And across every significant wall, surface-hung tapestries. Heavy, dense, woven from pounds of wool, and worth more than many families earned in a decade. This was not decoration, or rather, it was not merely decoration. And every layer served a thermal purpose. The plaster sealed porous stone against drafts. The rushes insulated the frozen ground beneath. The shutters created dead air spaces and window embrasures. And the tapestries, those enormous woven panels that strike modern museum visitors as purely ornamental, were the single most effective insulation technology of the medieval world. The economics told the story. A single large tapestry could cost more than a knight's annual income from his estates. Great lords spent fortunes acquiring match sets, not because they were vain, but because those textiles made the difference between a habitable castle and a miserable one. When a lord traveled between his residences, as medieval magnates constantly did, the tapestries traveled with him, rolled onto carts and transported by dedicated servants. The stone stayed behind. The warmth moved wherever the owner went. A well-appointed great hall in the 13th century was not a cold room with pretty things on the walls. It was a carefully assembled thermal envelope, built from layers of organic and mineral materials that collectively transformed a stone box into a space where people could live, work, and sleep through the darkest months of the European winter. The hidden paradox was this. These techniques worked so well precisely because they left no trace. Every material that kept the building warm was perishable. Wool rots, plaster crumbles, rushes decompose, wood burns. The insulation disappeared, and what remained behind, the naked stone, created the myth of the frozen medieval world that we still carry in our heads today. For most of the early medieval period, the Great Hall was heated by a single source, an open fire burning in the center of the room. Smoke rose, when it cooperated, through a hole in the roof called a louver. On calm days, the system worked tolerably. On windy nights, the hall filled with choking haze that stung the eyes and blackened the lungs. The charred roof beams found in surviving medieval halls are not a decorative patina. They are the residue of centuries of smoke with nowhere to go. But around the 12th century, a quiet revolution began. Fireplaces migrated from the center of the room to the walls. Stone chimneys, an innovation that had existed in limited form since Roman times but never spread widely, began appearing in castle after castle across England, France, and the Rhineland. The change seems minor. It was transformative. A central hearth heated one room and filled it with smoke. A wall fireplace with a chimney could heat a room cleanly, which meant rooms could be enclosed, reduced in size, and multiplied. The Great Hall did not disappear, but it gained company. Private chambers appeared above, beside, and behind it. The solar, a lord's private withdrawing room, became a standard feature of domestic architecture. For the first time in the history of Northern European building, warmth could be distributed through a structure rather than concentrated in a single communal space. This shift produced a cascade of consequences. Smaller rooms were easier to heat. They were also dramatically easier to insulate. And it was in this new world of enclosed chimney-served chambers that the medieval thermal toolkit reached its full sophistication. The most powerful weapon against cold in the medieval arsenal was cloth. Tapestries are the best-known example, but they sat at the top of a much broader system. A great lord's castle might feature Flemish tapestries, woven from fine wool and silk, depicting scenes from classical mythology or the romances of Charlemagne. These panels could measure 15 feet tall and 30 feet wide, each one weighing hundreds of pounds and requiring teams of weavers working for months. But even modest households use simpler wall hangings, heavy woolen cloths, painted linens, or dense canvas panels to cover interior stone surfaces. The physics was straightforward. A tapestry hung a few inches from a stone wall creates a pocket of trapped air. That pocket acts as an insulating barrier, all preventing body heat from conducting into the enormous cold mass of stone behind it. Modern thermal testing on historic buildings has confirmed what medieval builders understood intuitively. A single layer of heavy textile hung with a gap behind it can reduce heat loss through a stone wall by 40 to 50%. In practical terms, this meant the difference between a room at 45 degrees Fahrenheit and one at 60, the difference between endurance and comfort. The tapestries served a second thermal function that is less obvious but equally important. Cold stone radiates chill. Even in a room where the air has been warmed by a fire, a person sitting near an uninsulated stone wall will feel cold, not because the air temperature is low, but because their body is radiating heat toward the cold surface faster than the fire can replace it. This phenomenon, known in modern building science as radiant asymmetry, was one of the primary sources of discomfort in stone buildings. Textile hangings eliminated it. A wool surface at room temperature does not pull heat from the human body the way exposed stone does. The perceived warmth in a tapestried room was dramatically higher than in a bare one, even when a thermometer would have shown the same air temperature in both. Beneath and around the textiles, another insulating system was at work. Nearly every interior surface of a well-maintained medieval building was coated in lime plaster. The process was straightforward but labor-intensive. Workers mixed quicklime with sand and water. They applied it in successive coats directly onto the stone and allowed each layer to cure before adding the next. A finished wall might carry 3 or 4 coats, building up a smooth, hard surface several millimeters thick. The result was white, clean, and remarkably effective at sealing the countless small gaps and fissures through which cold air would otherwise infiltrate. Lime plaster is not a powerful insulator in the modern sense. Its thermal conductivity is roughly half that of solid stone, which helps marginally, but its primary thermal contribution was air tightness. A bare stone wall, particularly one built from roughly dressed rubble, as most medieval walls were, is riddled with tiny air passages. Wind finds those passages. On a stormy winter night, a room with bare stone walls becomes a room full of invisible drafts, each one carrying heat away. Plastered walls sealed those passages completely. The drafts stopped. The room held its heat. The plaster also served as a base for whitewash and paint. And here the thermal benefit was more subtle. White lime-washed walls reflected firelight and candlelight far more efficiently than dark stone, making rooms brighter with the same number of light sources. Psychologically, a bright room feels warmer than a dim one. When walls were painted in the deep reds, ochres, and warm earth tones that archaeological evidence shows were common in wealthier medieval homes, the psychological warmth intensified further. The floors told their own thermal story. Stone floors are perhaps the single most uncomfortable feature of a medieval building. Stone conducts heat with ruthless efficiency and holds cold with stubborn persistence. Standing barefoot on a stone floor in winter, as many medieval servants did, draws warmth from the body through the soles at a rate that no amount of overhead heating can compensate for. The solution was ancient and strikingly simple. Bury the floor under organic material, thick layers of rushes. The tall grasses that grow along rivers and marshes across northern Europe were spread across stone floors to a depth of several inches, sometimes more. In wealthier households, the rushes were mixed with aromatic herbs, lavender, chamomile, sweet woodruff, meadowsweet, and mint. The herbs served a double purpose. They helped mask the smell of the rushes as they aged. And several were believed, with varying degrees of accuracy, to ward off illness and vermin. The thermal effect was considerable. A layer of dried rushes 6 inches deep reduces heat transfer through a stone floor by roughly the same proportion as a modern carpet with underlay. The material trapped air in the spaces between its stems, creating a discontinuous insulating barrier between the cold stone and the warm feet above. For a material that grew wild along every riverbank in England, France, and the Low Countries, this was insulation at functionally zero cost. When the rushes grew foul or matted beyond recovery, they were swept out and replaced, a process that happened several times a year in well-run households, and considerably less often in others. Erasmus, writing in the early 16th century, and described English floors with something less than enthusiasm. The rushes, he observed, were sometimes left undisturbed for 20 years, with new layers simply piled on top of the old, trapping within them spilled ale, discarded food scraps, the waste of dogs, and substances he preferred not to name. The description is vivid enough to be memorable across 5 centuries. But even in their most unsanitary state, those compacted layers of organic material performed their thermal function with perfect indifference to their cleanliness. The most durable insulation was built into the stone itself. Medieval window design reveals a level of thermal sophistication that routinely surprises modern architects. Castle windows were small, not primarily for military defense, though that was a benefit, but because every opening was a breach in the thermal envelope. The embrasure, the deep splayed recess in which a castle window sits within the thickness of the wall, was itself a thermal device. By setting the glass or shutter plane deep within a wall that might be 8 or 10 feet thick, the embrasure created a buffer zone of still air between the exterior and the interior of the building. Shutters provided the primary seal. Most medieval windows had heavy wooden shutters that could be closed and latched at night or during storms, converting the window from an opening into a solid panel backed by the dead air of the embrasure. During the day, translucent materials filled the gap. In oiled linen and parchment stretched over wooden frames allowed diffused light to enter while blocking most wind. Thin sheets of horn, scraped and polished until partially transparent, served the same function in regions where the technique was known. Glass existed in medieval Europe, but for domestic use it remained expensive and uncommon before the 14th century. Churches used it generously because religious institutions had the wealth, the motivation, and the skilled labor. Domestic glazing was another matter. Small diamond-shaped panes set in lead, cames began appearing in the windows of wealthy households from the 13th century onward, but full glazing of an entire building remained a marker of exceptional wealth well into the Tudor period. For most people, for most of the Middle Ages, a window was a shutter and a piece of stretched cloth. The chimney, as we have already seen, was the transformative heating innovation, but its secondary effects mattered as much as its primary function. A chimney draws air upward. That air must be replaced from somewhere. In a reasonably well-sealed room with a functioning fireplace, the fire creates a gentle but continuous circulation. Cold air infiltrates through whatever gaps remain, warms as it moves through the room, rises toward the ceiling, and exits through the flue. The pattern is crude compared to a modern forced air system, but the principle is identical. The chimney did not merely remove smoke, it set the air in motion. When the broader room could not be made warm enough, medieval people did something remarkably pragmatic. They made the space smaller. The four-poster bed is not a decorative luxury. It is a room within a room, Heavy curtains drawn around all four sides created an enclosed volume roughly the size of a modern wardrobe laid on its side. Body heat from one or two sleepers would warm that enclosed space to a comfortable temperature within minutes, regardless of what the air in the wider chamber was doing. A well-curtained bed in an otherwise unheated room could maintain an interior temperature 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit above the ambient air, warm enough to sleep comfortably even in the depths of a northern winter. The same principle operated during the day. Wooden screens, solid panels, or heavy cloth stretched over frames were positioned around seating areas near fireplaces to trap heat in compact zones. A lord sitting in a high-back settle near a fire, next with a screen at his back and tapestried walls to either side, was effectively enclosed in a box of warm air no larger than a generous closet. The rest of the great hall might sit at 40 degrees. His immediate environment was 65. This layered approach, textile, mineral, organic, architectural, microclimatic, was not the invention of a single mind or the product of a single era. It was the accumulated practical wisdom of generations who had no alternative but to solve the problem of cold with whatever materials lay within reach. Stone and lime and wool and rushes and wood and fire. Nothing that required industrial processing, nothing that demanded fuel beyond what a fireplace already consumed. Nothing that a community with access to a forest, a flock of sheep, and a riverbank could not produce entirely from its own resources. The medieval thermal toolkit did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because something louder replaced it. Coal, and later gas and electricity, made it possible to heat buildings by overwhelming force. Fuel was cheap, radiators were efficient, and central heating turned every room in a house into a warm room regardless of its insulation, its orientation, or its relationship to the rest of the structure. The layers became unnecessary. Plaster survived, but only for appearance. Rushes vanished entirely. Tapestries migrated to museums, where they are displayed behind glass and admired as art by visitors who have no idea they were originally technology. Shutters became decorative. The curtain bed survived as a period curiosity in country houses. The trade-off was characteristic of modernity. We gained convenience. We gained uniformity. We gained the ability to wear light clothing indoors in January. But we also gained total dependency on fuel, on infrastructure, on supply chains and power grids that demand constant inputs of energy to maintain comfort every hour of every day. A medieval great hall with its tapestries, its plaster, its rushes, and its fire could sustain livable temperatures even when the entire supply chain consisted of a nearby forest and a flock of sheep. A modern home with its boiler switched off during a power cut reveals, within a few uncomfortable hours, exactly how thin the margin between comfort and cold has become. Building scientists have begun to notice. Over the past 2 decades, research into historic thermal strategies has accelerated, driven partly by academic curiosity and partly by the urgent economics of energy efficiency. The passive insulation principles that medieval builders developed through centuries of trial and error, thermal mass, trapped air gaps, natural fiber insulation, radiant barrier management, micro-zoning, are precisely the principles that now underpin the most advanced low-energy building designs in Europe and North America. A passive house in Freiburg and a 13th century Great Hall in Yorkshire are solving the same problem with the same physics. The vocabulary is different, the thermodynamics are identical. The next time you walk through a ruined castle and feel the cold settle into your bones, remember this. You are standing inside a stripped skeleton, not a living building. Every surface that once held warmth, the plaster, the cloth, and in the rushes, the shutters, the screens, has been gone